What you were taught about Africa's poverty is wrong. Not partially wrong, completely, deliberately, systematically wrong. And by the end of this, you will never look at a map of Africa the same way again. Here's the question nobody asks out loud. How does a continent that sits on top of the largest reserves of gold, diamonds, cobalt, uranium, and oil on the planet somehow become the poorest region in the world? How does that math work? Because it doesn't. Not unless something happened. Not unless someone made it happen. And that is exactly what this is about. But before we get to the bombshell, you need to understand the foundation. Because the real story doesn't start with corrupt politicians or civil wars. It starts with something far more calculated. Something that was planned in a single room by men in suits who never once set foot on African soil. Berlin, winter of 1884. 14 European nations sit around a table and divide an entire continent between themselves. No African leaders are invited. Not a single one. The men in that room have maps, they have rulers, and they have absolutely zero interest in the tens of millions of people already living on that land. They draw straight lines, clean, geometric, ruler-perfect lines, directly through mountains, through rivers, through ancient trade routes, through communities that had existed for centuries before Europe even knew these places existed. One stroke of a pen and the Juve people of West Africa are split between British and German territory overnight. The Somali people find themselves carved into 5 separate colonial zones, controlled by 3 different foreign powers. The Maasai of East Africa are cut clean in half by a border drawn between Britain and Germany, a border that means nothing to them but will define their descendants' lives forever. These are not abstract lines on paper. These are wounds cut through living, breathing, functioning societies. Now here is where it gets dark, because those borders did not just separate families, they did something far more destructive to the future of every nation they created. They forced hundreds of different ethnic groups, speaking different languages, worshiping different gods, carrying generations of historical rivalries, into single artificial states and called them countries. And then Europe handed those countries to local elites and said, "Good luck, you're independent now." Think about what that actually means. You cannot build a functioning nation when half the population feels no loyalty to the state. You cannot build stable institutions when different groups inside your borders are competing for control of a government that was never designed to serve them equally. You cannot build an economy when a third of your energy as a government goes into simply holding the country together. And yet that is exactly the situation every newly independent African nation inherited in the 1960s. But the borders are only half the story, and honestly, not even the most damaging half. Here is what most people never learn about colonialism in Africa. The Europeans were not just stealing resources. They were engineering a system designed to make Africa permanently dependent. Every road they built went from a mine to a port. Not from city to city, not connecting communities to markets. Mine to port. Extract, ship, gone. The infrastructure of an entire continent was designed with one purpose: to move African wealth out of Africa as efficiently as possible. There were no roads connecting the interior of the continent to itself. There were no rail lines linking neighboring regions. There were no ports built to facilitate trade between African nations. Why would the colonizers build those? Internal African trade meant Africans getting wealthy from each other. That was never the plan. The plan was a one-way pipe. Raw materials flow out, finished goods flow back in, at prices that Africa has to pay with the money it just made selling its own resources. And this is where the trap snaps shut. Because when independence finally came in the 1960s, African nations inherited this infrastructure of extraction. They had roads, but roads that only served foreign economic interests. They had ports, but ports designed for export, not development. They had government buildings, but governments modeled on colonial administrations built for control, not for service. The entire apparatus of the state was engineered to extract, not to build. The local elites who took power many of them educated in European universities, many of them groomed by colonial administrations, stepped into a machine that was already running. And the machine only knew how to do one thing. The question was never whether they would run it differently. The question was whether the machine could even be changed at all, given everything stacked against them from day one. And here's what nobody tells you about those early years of independence. The laws protecting property rights barely existed. Courts were weak or non-existent in practice. If you built a business and someone with political connections wanted it, there was very little stopping them from taking it. Without property rights, there is no investment. Without investment, there is no industry. Without industry, there is no middle class. Without a middle class, there is no tax base. Without a tax base, there is no government capable of building anything. Every single link in that chain was broken before the starting gun even fired. So the next time someone tells you Africa is poor because Africans are somehow failing, remember this. The starting line was not just uneven. The starting line was designed to make finishing impossible. The race was rigged before anyone laced up their shoes. And that is only part one. Because the colonial legacy is just the foundation. What gets built on top of it, the geography, the climate, the resource curse, the corruption, the demographic explosion, that is where the story gets even more impossible to believe. Stay with this, because what comes next changes everything you think you know about why poverty exists and who is actually responsible for it. Part 2 of 5, The Prison Without Walls. Before we get to Part 2, remember what we established in Part 1. The borders were fake. The infrastructure was a trap. The institutions were broken from birth. Keep that in your head, because now we are going to talk about something that makes all of that even worse. Something that no politician can fix with a speech. Something that no aid package can solve with a check. We are going to talk about the land itself. Because here is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. Geography is not neutral. Where you are born on this planet determines your economic destiny in ways that are almost impossible to escape. And Africa drew one of the worst geographic hands in human history. Not because the land is poor, we already established the land is absurdly rich, but because of how that land is shaped, where it sits, and what lives inside it. Start with this number, 16. That is how many African countries are completely landlocked, surrounded on every side by other countries, with zero access to the ocean. 16 nations that cannot ship a single product to the global market without first crossing someone else's border. Chad, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia before Eritrea's independence changed the map. Zimbabwe, Zambia, Uganda. These are not small territories. Some of them are enormous. And every single one of them faces a cost of doing business that their coastal competitors simply do not face. Here is what that means in real economic terms. When a landlocked African country wants to export goods, say copper from Zambia or cotton from Mali, those goods have to travel overland through neighboring countries before they reach a port. That means paying fees at multiple borders. That means navigating roads that may or may not be passable depending on the season. That means dealing with customs bureaucracies in countries you do not control. The average cost of transporting goods for a landlocked African nation is roughly double what it costs for a coastal country. Double. Before your product even reaches a ship, before it even enters the global market, you are already losing. And here is the cliff that most people never see coming. Those neighboring countries that landlocked nations depend on for access to ports, many of them are politically unstable. Many of them have their own border conflicts. Many of them have roads that are barely functional. So you are not just dependent on your neighbor. You are dependent on your neighbor's government, your neighbor's infrastructure, your neighbor's stability. If their country has a bad year, your exports stop. Your economy bleeds, and you had no say in any of it. But landlocked geography is only the beginning of the geographic nightmare, because now we need to talk about rain. In most of the developed world, Farmers plant crops with a reasonable expectation of when rain will come. Seasons are predictable enough to plan around. Modern irrigation fills the gaps. Storage systems handle surpluses. Insurance covers bad years. In sub-Saharan Africa, none of those safety nets exist at scale. The overwhelming majority of African farmers, we are talking about hundreds of millions of people who grow food for themselves and their communities, are entirely dependent on rainfall that has become increasingly unpredictable. When the rains come late, crops fail. When the rains come too hard, floods destroy everything that survived the drought. When the rains simply do not come at all, which is happening with greater frequency as the Sahara Desert expands southward at a rate of roughly 48 kilometers per year in some regions, entire communities face starvation. This is not a temporary problem. This is a structural, worsening, generational crisis that is literally eating the continent from the north downward. The Sahel, that band of semi-arid land stretching across Africa just below the Sahara, is one of the most climate-vulnerable regions on Earth. Countries like Niger, Chad, Mali, and Burkina Faso sit directly in its path. The soil in these regions is degrading. Farmland that supported communities for generations is turning to dust. And the people who depend on that land have nowhere to go except toward cities that are already overwhelmed, or toward borders that are already closed. Here is what makes this economically catastrophic, in a way that compounds everything else we have already discussed. When a country cannot reliably feed itself, it cannot focus on building anything else. Every drought becomes a national emergency. Every failed harvest pulls government resources away from education, infrastructure, and economic development, and redirects them toward basic survival. You cannot build factories when people are hungry. You cannot attract investors when the food supply is uncertain. You cannot develop a workforce when a significant portion of that workforce is malnourished. And then, just when you think the geographic challenges cannot stack any higher, we need to talk about disease. Because this is the part of the story that development economists have been arguing about for decades, and the numbers are staggering. Malaria alone kills hundreds of thousands of people in Africa every year. The vast majority of those deaths are children under 5 years old. But the death toll, as horrifying as it is not even the biggest economic problem. The bigger problem is what malaria does to the people who survive it. A child who has malaria repeatedly throughout early childhood suffers measurable, documented damage to cognitive development. Studies have shown that regions with high malaria prevalence have significantly lower economic output, not just because people are sick, but because the disease literally affects brain development during the years when children are supposed to be learning. The tsetse fly, which exists almost exclusively in sub-Saharan Africa, carries a disease called sleeping sickness that is fatal to both humans and livestock. Its presence across a massive stretch of the continent has historically made large-scale agriculture with animals almost impossible in affected regions. Think about what that means for a farming economy. No horses for plowing, no oxen for transport, no cattle for sustained dairy production. The tsetse fly effectively blocked the development of the kind of animal-powered agriculture that allowed other civilizations to scale food production for thousands of years. HIV has infected tens of millions of people across sub-Saharan Africa, more than anywhere else on Earth. The economic consequences reach far beyond healthcare costs. When adults in their most productive working years become sick, families lose their primary income earners. Children lose parents and drop out of school to work. Communities lose teachers, farmers, engineers, nurses. The disease does not just kill individuals, it systematically destroys the human capital that economies are built from. Now, stack all of this on top of everything from Part 1. Fake borders creating unstable states, infrastructure designed for extraction, broken institutions inherited from colonial administrations, and now, 16 landlocked countries paying double to reach global markets. Rainfall patterns collapsing under climate pressure, soil turning to desert, diseases suppressing cognitive development, killing workers in their prime, and eliminating entire categories of agricultural possibility. This is not a development problem. This is a siege, a continent under siege from multiple directions simultaneously, with no walls to hide behind and no cavalry coming. And here is the part that should make your stomach drop. Everything we have covered so far, the history, the geography, the climate, the disease, all of it could theoretically be overcome. Other regions have faced terrible starting conditions and built their way out. So why hasn't Africa? Why, with all that gold and oil and diamonds sitting in the ground, has the wealth never translated into development? That answer is coming in part 3, and it is the most infuriating part of this entire story. Because it turns out that having resources is not just unhelpful. In the specific conditions Africa inherited, having resources might actually make poverty worse. Stop. Before you read another word, go back and hold on to that last sentence from part 2. Having resources might actually make poverty worse. That sounds insane. That sounds like something someone made up to excuse failure. But it is not made up. It has a name. Economists have studied it for decades, and once you understand how it works, you will see it everywhere, in the news, in the headlines, in every story about an African nation that should be rich and somehow isn't. It is called the resource curse, and it is one of the most brutal, most elegant, most perfectly designed poverty traps that has ever existed on this planet. Here's how it works. A country discovers oil, or diamonds, or gold. Suddenly, there is an enormous amount of money flowing into the government. Not from taxes, not from a productive economy, not from millions of citizens building businesses and paying into a system. From one source, one pipe, one commodity. And that changes everything about how power works inside that country. In a normal economy, governments need their citizens to be productive. They need businesses to succeed. They need workers to earn wages, because that is where tax revenue comes from. And because governments need that revenue, they have an incentive, a real, practical financial incentive, to protect property rights, build courts, invest in education, maintain roads. A government that serves its citizens is not just being noble, it is being rational. It needs them. But a government that gets its money from an oil pipeline does not need its citizens the same way. It does not need them to be educated. It does not need them to be entrepreneurial. It does not need a thriving private sector generating taxable income. It just needs the oil to keep flowing. And the people who control the oil control everything. The entire political logic of the country shifts. Power stops being about serving the population and starts being about controlling the resource. This is not a theory. This is documented history playing out across the continent in real time. Nigeria sits on some of the largest oil reserves in the world. Since oil was discovered there in the late 1950s, Nigeria has earned an estimated total of several $100 billion from petroleum exports. Today, roughly 40% of Nigerians live in extreme poverty. The Niger Delta, the actual physical place where the oil comes out of the ground, is one of the most environmentally devastated and economically desperate regions in the entire country. The people living directly on top of the wealth see almost none of it. The money flows up, out, and away. The Democratic Republic of Congo contains an estimated $24 trillion worth of mineral wealth beneath its soil. Cobalt, coltan, gold, diamonds, copper. The world's technology industry literally cannot function without Congolese minerals. Your smartphone contains elements that came from the DRC. And yet the DRC consistently ranks among the poorest nations on Earth. Life expectancy hovers around 60 years. A significant portion of children suffer from malnutrition. Infrastructure barely exists outside major cities. $24 trillion in the ground, and almost none of it reaches the people standing on top of it. Angola exported oil worth tens of billions of dollars during the 2000s, while its infant mortality rate remained among the highest in the world. Equatorial Guinea has more oil wealth per capita than many European nations and has consistently ranked near the bottom of global human development indexes. These are not coincidences. These are the resource curse, operating exactly as economists predicted it would. But here's the layer underneath the obvious corruption story, because blaming it all on corrupt leaders, while partially accurate, misses the deeper structural problem. Even when resource revenues are managed with reasonable honesty, they create a different kind of economic trap, one that is almost invisible until it is too late. When a country earns most of its foreign income from one exported commodity, oil, copper, cocoa, coffee, its entire budget becomes hostage to the global price of that one thing. And global commodity prices are set in trading rooms in London and New York and Chicago by people who have never been to Africa and have no interest in African economic stability. When the price of oil drops by half, as it did in 2014, countries like Nigeria and Angola lose half their government revenue overnight. Not gradually. Overnight. Schools close. Infrastructure projects stop. Healthcare budgets get cut, and the population suffers the consequences of a decision made 10,000 kilometers away by traders responding to global supply dynamics that have nothing to do with Africa. This is what economists mean when they talk about export concentration. When your entire economy depends on selling one thing, you are not running a country. You are running a very large, very fragile commodity bet. And the house always wins. Now combine this with the absence of industrialization, and here is where the trap becomes truly inescapable. Africa mines copper. That copper gets shipped raw to factories in China, in Europe, in North America. Those factories turn the copper into wiring, into electronics, into industrial components. Those finished products get sold back to Africa at prices 10, 20, sometimes 50 times higher than the raw material was worth. Africa provides the raw material, the world provides the transformation. And the transformation is where all the real money is made. This pattern, selling cheap raw materials and buying back expensive finished goods, is not accidental. It is the direct economic descendant of the colonial extraction model we described in Part 1. The mine-to-port infrastructure built by colonial powers was designed for exactly this purpose. And even after independence, the economic relationship barely changed. The flags changed. The faces in government changed, but Africa's role in the global economy remained the same: supplier of cheap inputs, consumer of expensive outputs. The manufacturing sector across sub-Saharan Africa accounts for a fraction of global industrial production, so small it barely registers in the statistics. Countries like South Korea, which had a similar economic profile to many African nations in the 1960s, made a deliberate choice to industrialize, to build factories, develop technical education, create domestic manufacturing capacity. Decades later, South Korea is one of the most technologically advanced economies on Earth. The path existed, but the conditions in Africa, the instability, the infrastructure gaps, the broken institutions, the geographic isolation, made walking that path almost impossibly difficult. And underneath all of this, underneath the oil money and the mining revenues and the commodity price swings, there is an economy that most governments can barely see, let alone tax. The informal economy. The hundreds of millions of people selling food by the roadside, farming small plots for subsistence, running unlicensed repair shops, trading goods across borders with no documentation. Estimates suggest that up to 85% of workers across sub-Saharan Africa operate entirely outside the formal economy. Think about what that means for a government trying to build anything. If the overwhelming majority of your population's economic activity is invisible to the tax system, you have almost no domestic revenue base. You cannot build roads, you cannot maintain power grids, you cannot fund schools. You become dependent on either resource revenues, with all the instability that brings, or foreign aid, with all the dependency and conditionality that brings. Either way, you are not in control of your own economic future. The informal economy is not a sign of laziness or illegality. It is a rational response to a system that offers no protection, no services, and no incentive to formalize. Why register your business when registration costs money you do not have, when the courts will not protect you anyway, when the tax money you pay will never come back to you as roads or electricity or security. The informal economy is millions of people making the only logical choice available to them inside a broken system. And that broken system, the governments that cannot collect taxes, cannot protect property, cannot attract investment, cannot industrialize, is what we are going to examine in Part 4. Because we have not yet talked about what happens inside the halls of power. We have not yet talked about the money that disappears, the coups, the wars, the investors who come, see the chaos, and leave. Part 4 is where this story gets personal, because it is about choices. Choices made by real people with real power who knew exactly what they were doing. And the cost of those choices is still being paid by hundreds of millions of people who had no say in any of it. Remember the resource curse from Part 3. Remember the broken institutions from Part 1. Hold both of those in your mind right now, because Part 4 is where those two things collide, and what they produce when they collide is something so destructive, so systemic, so perfectly self-reinforcing that it has kept an entire continent locked in poverty for generations. We are talking about the machinery of bad governance, and we are not talking about a few bad leaders making poor decisions. We are talking about a system, a deliberate, calculated, self-sustaining system that was built to serve the people at the top and nobody else. Start with a number. More than 220. That is how many coup attempts Africa has experienced in the 70 years since independence began, sweeping the continent in the 1960s. More than 220 times, a government was overthrown or someone tried to overthrow it by force. That is not political instability. That is a continent where the very concept of peaceful power transfer has been structurally impossible in enormous portions of the land. And every single one of those coups, successful or failed, carries an economic price tag that gets paid by ordinary people. Here is what a coup actually does to an economy, not in the dramatic Hollywood sense, but in the quiet, grinding, devastating economic sense. The day a coup happens, foreign investors freeze, contracts get suspended, construction projects stop, international banks pull credit lines, companies that were considering building factories or opening offices quietly close their folders and move their attention somewhere safer. And the damage does not end when the coup ends. The damage lasts for years, because investors have long memories. Political risk does not disappear when a new government announces stability. It lingers. It compounds. It becomes part of the permanent calculation every outside business makes when looking at that country. Now multiply that across decades. Multiply it across dozens of countries. Multiply it across a continent where the uncertainty is not occasional, but chronic. Where the question is never whether instability will come, but simply when and where. And you begin to understand why Africa attracts a fraction of the global foreign direct investment that its resources and population size should logically command. The risk premium is simply too high for most serious long-term capital to stomach. But political instability is only the visible surface of the governance crisis. Underneath it, running constantly, whether the government is stable or collapsing, is something quieter and far more corrosive. Corruption. Not petty corruption, not a traffic cop asking for a small payment or a bureaucrat charging a fee to process paperwork faster. Systematic, industrial-scale, institutionalized corruption that operates at the very top of governments and extracts wealth from entire nations with the efficiency of a well-run corporation. The numbers here are almost impossible to process emotionally. Estimates from organizations tracking illicit financial flows suggest that somewhere between $50 billion and $80 billion leaves Africa illegally every single year. Every year. That is money that was supposed to belong to African governments, revenue from natural resources, from taxes, from development funds, that instead ends up in private bank accounts in Switzerland, in shell companies registered in the British Virgin Islands, in luxury real estate in London and Paris and Dubai. bought by people who were supposed to be managing their nation's wealth on behalf of their citizens. To put that in perspective, the entire annual foreign aid flowing into Africa from all sources combined is roughly $50 billion per year, which means that roughly as much money as the entire world sends to Africa in aid is simultaneously being stolen out of Africa by the people running it. The continent is hemorrhaging from a wound that aid packages are being used to bandage, while nobody stops the bleeding. And here is the mechanism that makes this possible, the mechanism that connects back to everything we have already discussed. When a government's revenue comes primarily from natural resources rather than from taxing a productive population, the government is not accountable to its citizens in any practical financial sense. A government that needs your taxes needs to answer to you. A government that gets its money from an oil company operating under a concession agreement needs to answer only to the people who signed that agreement. The citizens become irrelevant to the financial survival of the state. And when citizens are irrelevant to the financial survival of the state stops serving the citizens. This is not a cynical theory. This is the documented operational reality of governance across significant portions of the continent. Leaders award mining and oil contracts to companies that pay the largest personal kickbacks, rather than the largest royalties to the national treasury. Infrastructure projects get awarded to contractors who inflate costs by 300% and 400% and split the difference with government officials. National development funds get redirected into private investments abroad, and the roads stay broken. The schools stay underfunded. The hospitals stay empty of medicine. The physical infrastructure deficit this creates is staggering in its real-world consequences. Roughly half of the population of sub-Saharan Africa lives without reliable access to electricity. Not occasional blackouts, which happen everywhere, but genuine, structural absence of power for significant portions of every day. Think about what that means for economic activity. You cannot run a factory on intermittent power. You cannot maintain cold storage for food products without consistent electricity. You cannot operate modern medical equipment. You cannot power the servers that run digital businesses. Every hour without electricity is an hour of economic activity that simply does not happen. Road networks across much of the continent remain so underdeveloped that farmers cannot get crops to markets before they rot. Medical supplies cannot reach clinics in rural areas. Children cannot get to schools that are more than walking distance away. The physical disconnection of communities from economic opportunity is not a metaphor. It is a literal, measurable, daily reality that costs lives and destroys economic potential at a scale that is almost impossible to quantify. And then conflict arrives and destroys even what little exists. Armed conflicts in Africa. Whether they are ethnic clashes amplified by those colonial-era artificial borders we discussed in Part 1, or resource wars fought over control of mineral wealth, or political violence following disputed elections, do something to infrastructure that takes decades to undo. Roads get destroyed, bridges get blown up, factories get looted, schools get burned, hospitals get abandoned. And when the fighting stops, if it stops, the country does not return to where it was before. It returns to something worse. Because the people who built those things are gone. The engineers fled, the doctors emigrated, the teachers left. And starting over from a lower baseline, with a traumatized population and a government that has no money, is almost impossibly hard. This is the concept economists call the conflict trap. Countries that experience civil war become significantly more likely to experience another civil war within the following decade. Because conflict destroys the economic foundations that provide stability, and instability breeds more conflict. The trap feeds itself. Here is the detail that should make everything click into place. The countries most affected by chronic conflict in Africa are overwhelmingly the countries richest in natural resources. The Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, sitting on top of some of the most valuable mineral deposits on Earth, has experienced continuous armed conflict for decades. The oil-rich Niger Delta has been a zone of ongoing violence and instability for generations. The diamond fields of Sierra Leone fueled one of the most brutal civil wars in modern African history. The resources do not prevent the conflict. In the specific conditions of weak institutions and broken governance that Africa inherited, the resources cause the conflict. Because controlling the resources means controlling everything. And when everything is at stake, people fight to the death for control of it. So here is where we stand after 4 parts of this story. Artificial borders creating permanent ethnic tension, colonial infrastructure designed for extraction, broken institutions inherited from repressive administrations, geographic isolation doubling trade costs, climate collapse threatening food security, tropical diseases suppressing human capital development, a resource curse converting natural wealth into political poison, industrial-scale corruption draining $50 to $80 billion annually from government revenues, chronic political instability terrifying away the foreign investment that could break the cycle, and an infrastructure deficit so severe that half the population lacks reliable electricity. Stack all of that, every single layer of it, and then ask yourself, what does a population do when it is born into all of that simultaneously? The answer is coming in part 5, and it is the most complicated part of this entire story. Because part 5 is not just about problems. Part 5 is about 140 million young Africans entering the workforce every decade into an economy that cannot absorb them. It is about children who cannot read. It is about a demographic wave that could either save the continent or break it completely, depending on decisions being made right now. And buried inside part 5, there is something that almost nobody in Western media talks about. A genuine, documented, already happening reason for real hope. Something that Africa is not just doing well, but doing better than almost anywhere else on Earth. Something that might change everything. That is next.